Angela Weathers stood in the hallway outside her own bedroom, one hand still resting on the doorframe, and she did not move. The phone was pressed against Marcus's ear by his mother, and through the thin gap in the door, she heard her husband say the words that would end the marriage she had spent 2 years trying to save. "She's basically my servant at this point, Ma. 4 seconds. That's all it took. 4 seconds to undo 730 days of lifting him, bathing him, feeding him, and telling herself that love looked like sacrifice." She did not gasp. She did not drop anything. She stood there in the dark hallway of a house she had rebuilt her whole life around, and something inside her went completely, permanently still. What does loyalty look like when it gets handed back to you like garbage? What does a woman do with 2 years of her life once she finds out the man she gave it to saw her as nothing more than hired help who happened to share his last name? Angela didn't scream. She didn't confront him that night, or the next morning, or even that week. What she did instead was quieter than anyone watching her life from the outside could have guessed, and far more devastating to Marcus than any argument could have been. This is the story of what happens when a woman stops performing loyalty and starts calculating exactly what she's owed. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand how Angela ended up frozen in that hallway, you have to go back to the accident that put Marcus in a wheelchair, and further back than that, to the woman Angela used to be before she rearranged her entire identity around being someone's caretaker. 2 years earlier, Marcus Weathers was a construction site foreman in Charlotte, North Carolina, the kind of man who came home covered in drywall dust and complained about his knees but never once thought his body would betray him completely. He fell 3 stories off a scaffold that hadn't been inspected properly. He survived. His spine did not survive intact. The doctors told Angela her husband would never walk again, and in that hospital corridor, without anyone asking her to, she made a decision that would define the next 2 years of her life. Angela had been a certified nursing assistant before the accident, working nights at a rehabilitation facility on the north side of the city, building toward her RN license one exam at a time. She gave that up within a month of Marcus coming home. Somebody had to manage his catheter schedule, his physical therapy appointments, his medications, the wound care on the pressure sores that kept threatening to develop no matter how carefully she turned him every few hours. She told herself it was temporary, that once he stabilized, she'd go back to school, back to work, back to the version of herself that existed before a scaffold gave way 3 stories above a construction site. That version of Angela never came back. The friends started disappearing first, the way they always do when a marriage becomes a full-time medical rotation. Angela stopped answering texts about girls' nights because she couldn't leave Marcus alone for more than 2 hours at a stretch. Her sister Lisa was the only one who kept showing up, kept calling, kept asking Angela if she was eating, if she was sleeping, if she remembered what her own face looked like without exhaustion carved into it. Angela always said she was fine. She said it so many times that she almost believed it herself, right up until the night she stood in that hallway and heard exactly how Marcus had been describing her to his mother when he thought she couldn't hear. Doreen, Marcus's mother, had never fully warmed to Angela, not even at the wedding, not even in the early years when things were good. She was the kind of mother-in-law who complimented your cooking in a tone that suggested she expected better, who asked pointed questions about when grandchildren might be coming along, as though Angela's uterus owed her something. After the accident, Doreen started coming around more often, ostensibly to help, though her version of help mostly involved sitting in the living room, directing Angela on how to fold towels correctly while Marcus watched television. Angela absorbed it the way she absorbed most things during those 2 years, by telling herself it didn't matter, that what mattered was Marcus's recovery, that the rest was noise she could tune out. What Angela didn't know, what she had no way of knowing as she managed his care with a devotion that bordered on martyrdom, was that Marcus had been keeping something from her for the better part of 8 months. There was a folder in his nightstand drawer, locked, that he told her contained old insurance paperwork not worth digging through. Angela had asked about it exactly twice in 2 years and been waved off both times with the same tired explanation. She let it go because she had 100 other things demanding her attention every single day, and because after 2 years of marriage to a man in a wheelchair, you learn which battles are worth having the energy for. That folder would turn out to be the single most important object in this entire story. Renee had been Marcus's girlfriend for 3 years before Angela, a relationship that ended badly enough that Marcus rarely mentioned her name in the house. In the months before the overheard phone call, Renee started reappearing, first through mutual friends on social media, then through what Marcus described to Angela as innocent check-ins between old friends who'd grown up together. Angela noticed the frequency of these check-ins increasing. She noticed Marcus's phone angled away from her more often, noticed him smiling at messages he didn't share the contents of. She said nothing, because 2 years of caregiving had taught her to pick her battles, and because some part of her, the part that still loved the man he used to be, didn't want to know what she suspected she already knew. The night of the overheard call started like any other. Angela had just finished Marcus's evening medication routine, had gotten him settled with the television remote and a glass of water within reach, and had gone to change out of clothes that smelled like antiseptic and dinner. She heard his phone ring from the living room, heard him answer it, heard the particular warmth in his voice that meant it was his mother, rather than anyone from the rehabilitation clinic. She wasn't listening on purpose. She was folding laundry in the next room when Doreen's voice, tinny through the speaker, asked how Angela was holding up these days, whether she was still keeping the house in order the way a wife should. And then came Marcus's answer, delivered so casually it barely registered as cruelty to him at all. "She's basically my servant at this point, Ma. I don't even have to ask anymore. She just knows what to do." Doreen laughed. Angela did not. She stood there holding a folded towel against her chest for what felt like an hour but was probably closer to 90 seconds, listening to her husband continue the conversation as though he hadn't just described 2 years of her devotion as domestic labor from a woman he barely respected. He moved on to talking about a doctor's appointment scheduling conflict. He asked his mother about her garden. Life continued in that living room exactly as it had continued every evening for 2 years, except that in the hallway, something in Angela had finished breaking in a way that couldn't be repaired by an apology, if one had even been coming. She finished folding the towel. She put it away. She did not say a single word to Marcus that night, and that silence would become the most important decision she made in this entire story. Would you have stayed quiet that first night, or would you have walked into that living room and demanded he repeat what he'd just said to her face? Angela chose silence, but not the kind that means surrender. Over the next several days, she began paying attention in a way she hadn't allowed herself to in months, watching Marcus's phone habits, noticing which appointments Doreen suddenly wanted to accompany them to, noticing how often Renee's name came up in conversations Marcus thought were casual enough to have in front of her. She started asking herself a question she'd been avoiding since the accident. What exactly had 2 years of her life bought her, and what was locked inside that folder Marcus kept guarding in his nightstand drawer? Angela did not confront Marcus the morning after the phone call, and she didn't confront him the week after either. What she did instead started so small that Marcus barely noticed for the first several days. She stopped anticipating his needs before he voiced them, the way she'd trained herself to do over 2 years of caregiving. If he wanted water, he had to ask for it now instead of finding it already refilled beside him. If his medication schedule slipped by 20 minutes because she was in another room, she no longer rushed to correct it the second she remembered. None of it looked like rebellion from the outside. It looked like a tired woman getting a little slower, a little less sharp. Marcus noticed the change before he understood what was causing it, and that gap between noticing and understanding would cost him everything. Within 2 weeks, Angela had quietly hired a part-time home health aide named Patricia, using money from an account Marcus didn't monitor closely, an account that still had her maiden name attached to it from before the wedding. She told Marcus it was to give herself time to job hunt, to start rebuilding the nursing career she'd set aside. And technically, that was true. What she didn't tell him was that she'd started sleeping in the guest room 3 nights out of 7, citing his restless movements disturbing her sleep, which was also technically true, just not the whole truth. Marcus accepted the explanations because he had no reason yet to suspect his wife of anything more calculated than exhaustion. 2 years of predictable devotion had taught him to expect it would always be there. Doreen noticed the shift faster than her son did, the way mothers-in-law with something to protect tend to notice things. She started calling more often, dropping by unannounced under the excuse of checking on Marcus, though her real attention kept drifting toward Angela's new schedule, the job applications Angela mentioned in passing, the slight coolness that had crept into how Angela addressed her. During one visit, Doreen cornered Angela in the kitchen and told her, in the gentle but unmistakable tone of a woman drawing a line, that a wife's place was beside her husband during his hardest years, not chasing careers she'd already given up once before. Angela smiled, said nothing, and went back to the sink. She had stopped needing Doreen's approval the night she heard the word servant come out of her son's mouth. It was during one of Patricia's shifts, when Angela finally had 2 consecutive free hours for the first time in longer than she could remember, that she found herself standing in front of Marcus's nightstand with the drawer half open. She had never gone looking for the key before, mostly out of the same exhaustion that kept her from fighting most battles during those 2 years. But something about the last few weeks had sharpened her curiosity into something closer to necessity. She found the key taped beneath the drawer itself, an almost insultingly simple hiding spot for a man who claimed the folder held nothing but old, worthless paperwork. Her hands were steady when she opened the lock. They were not steady 30 seconds later, once she understood what she was looking at. The folder contained a settlement statement from the construction company's insurance carrier, dated 8 months earlier, confirming a payout of just under $400,000 to Marcus Weathers for injuries sustained in the workplace fall. 8 months. Angela had been managing his catheter changes and pressure sore treatments for 8 months, believing they were still waiting on a case that hadn't resolved, believing the financial strain they both discussed at the kitchen table was a real and ongoing burden. While Marcus sat across from her every single one of those nights, knowing the money had already cleared. She sat down on the edge of the bed and read through every page twice, because the number alone wasn't the part that had stopped her breath. It was the transfer record stapled behind it. Roughly a third of the settlement had already moved out of Marcus's primary account into a secondary account Angela didn't recognize, one that required a co-signer's name she did recognize immediately, because it belonged to Doreen. Angela sat with that folder open on her lap for what felt like a very long time, working through what it meant that her husband had been quietly funneling a significant portion of money that legally belonged to their shared household into an account controlled by his own mother, without a word to the woman who had spent 8 of those months believing there was no money at all. She thought about every conversation where Marcus had sighed about the cost of his physical therapy, every time she'd skipped buying herself something small because they needed to be careful. None of it had been necessary. All of it had been theater. What do you think was really going on in that house behind closed doors while Angela believed she was simply doing her duty as a wife? Because the folder answered one question and immediately raised 3 more, and Angela wasn't done digging. Tucked beneath the transfer records was a printed email exchange between Marcus and a woman whose name Angela recognized instantly, Renee. The emails weren't explicit, not in the way Angela had feared they might be, but they didn't need to be. They referenced plans, timing, a conversation about how much longer things needed to stay as they were before changes could be made without complications. Angela read the word complications 3 times before she understood Marcus meant her. She wasn't a wife in that email chain. She was a logistical problem with a projected resolution date. Angela put the folder back exactly as she'd found it, locked the drawer, and returned the key to its hiding spot beneath it. And for the next several days she gave no outward sign that anything had changed. This was, in some ways, the most difficult acting of her entire 2 years in that house. Harder than any night she'd managed his care while running on 3 hours of sleep. She continued Patricia's shifts. She continued the job applications, though now they carried a different kind of urgency behind them. And she began, carefully and quietly, gathering copies of everything she'd found, photographing pages on her phone during moments when Marcus was occupied with television or physical therapy exercises, building a record that couldn't simply be locked away and denied later. She reached out to Dr. Okafor's office under the guise of scheduling a routine follow-up appointment. And during that call, she asked a question she'd never thought to ask directly before, about Marcus's current mobility status and what recovery progress had actually looked like over recent months. What she learned complicated everything further. Dr. Okafor's most recent clinical notes documented mobility improvements that Marcus had never mentioned to Angela at all, improvements significant enough that his physical therapist had begun discussing a modified transfer chair and short-distance assisted walking, developments dated nearly 4 months back. Angela had spent those 4 months lifting him in ways that may no longer have been strictly necessary, believing his dependence on her was total, while Marcus allowed her to continue believing it because that dependence served a purpose beyond his physical recovery. It's worth pausing here to ask what you would have done in Angela's position, discovering not just financial dishonesty, but the possibility that your entire caregiving role had been extended past its necessity because it was convenient for the person deceiving you. Angela didn't confront Marcus with any of this immediately. Instead, she made an appointment with a family law attorney named Carla Bennett, using a lunch break from one of the few job interviews she'd started attending, and brought copies of the settlement documents, the transfer records, and notes from her call with Dr. Okafor's office. Bennett confirmed what Angela already suspected. North Carolina marital property law meant that settlement, having been received during the marriage, belonged jointly to both of them regardless of whose name appeared on the account, and the transfers to Doreen's co-signed account raised serious questions about concealment of marital assets. Lisa was the only person Angela told any of this to during those weeks, sitting across from her sister's kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon while Patricia covered Marcus's care back at the house. Lisa listened without interrupting, the way she always had during the hardest stretches of Angela's marriage. And when Angela finished laying out everything she'd found, Lisa asked her only one question. Not what Marcus had done, but what Angela wanted to do about it. Angela didn't have a complete answer yet, but she knew it wouldn't involve screaming matches or public humiliation. She had spent 2 years being quiet out of exhaustion. She intended her next silence to be strategic instead, and by the time she left Lisa's kitchen that afternoon, she had the outline of exactly what that would look like. Angela chose a Saturday afternoon for the confrontation, deliberately, because Patricia had the day off and Doreen was expected to visit at 3 o'clock for what she still believed was a routine family lunch. Angela wanted witnesses to what she was about to say, not to humiliate Marcus in front of his mother, but because she understood something about people like Doreen. Without a witness in the room, there would always be a version of events where Angela was the unreasonable one, the ungrateful wife who couldn't handle 2 years of hardship. She set the table as she always did, 3 places, nothing out of the ordinary, and when Doreen arrived at exactly 3, Angela waited until everyone had settled before she brought out the folder and set it in the center of the table without a word. Marcus recognized it immediately, and Angela watched something shift behind his eyes, the particular stillness of a man realizing the ground beneath him had already given way before he even understood he was falling. Doreen reached for the folder first, out of instinct more than permission, and Angela let her open it, let her see the settlement statement, the transfer records with her own name listed as co-signer on the receiving account. Doreen's face did not have time to arrange itself into anything convincing. Angela spoke calmly, the way she'd rehearsed it in the mirror the night before, laying out exactly what she'd found, and when she'd found it, without raising her voice once. She wasn't performing outrage. She had already moved past outrage into something colder and far more useful to her. Marcus tried the explanation he'd clearly prepared somewhere in the back of his mind for a moment like this one, that the money had been set aside for both of them, that Doreen was simply holding funds temporarily for tax purposes, that nothing untoward had happened. Angela let him finish before she placed the printed emails between Renee and Marcus on top of the settlement paperwork, and this time nobody at that table had a ready explanation. Doreen's expression finally cracked into something closer to panic than concern, because she understood, faster than her son did, exactly how badly this looked laid out on a kitchen table in front of a woman with copies, a lawyer, and 2 years of grievances she'd never once voiced out loud. Marcus started to speak. Angela raised one hand, and for the first time in 2 years, he actually stopped. She told him what Dr. Okafor's notes had shown, the mobility improvements documented months before Marcus had ever mentioned them to her, the modified transfer chair his physical therapist had already begun discussing without Angela's knowledge. She watched him understand, in real time, that she knew he had let her keep lifting him, keep managing a level of dependence he no longer strictly required, because that dependence gave him cover while he waited for the settlement to clear and worked out his timeline with Renee. The word servant hadn't been a careless slip on a phone call. It had been an honest description of what he needed her to remain until his plans were ready. A caretaker who wouldn't ask questions, wouldn't examine the finances too closely, wouldn't notice the folder in the drawer or the mobility he'd quietly been regaining. Marcus finally spoke, and what came out wasn't an apology so much as an attempt at negotiation, the kind men reach for when they realize the story they've been telling themselves about their own decency no longer holds up under scrutiny. He said the money was meant to protect their future. He said Renee was just an old friend going through a difficult divorce herself, nothing more. Angela listened to all of it without interruption, and when he finished, she told him she'd already met with an attorney, that North Carolina law considered the settlement marital property, regardless of which account it sat in, and that concealment of assets during a marriage carried its own consequences in a divorce proceeding. Doreen tried to interject on her son's behalf. Angela simply looked at her until she stopped talking. What followed over the next several weeks moved faster than Marcus seemed to expect, largely because Angela had already done the difficult work of preparation before she ever sat him down at that kitchen table. Carla Bennett filed the divorce paperwork with full financial disclosure requirements attached, forcing the transferred funds back into the marital estate for equitable division. Marcus's attempts to argue that Angela had abandoned her caregiving duties in recent weeks fell apart quickly once Dr. Okafor's documented mobility notes entered the record. Notes that made it clear Marcus's dependence on Angela had been considerably overstated for months before she ever slowed down. The settlement money, along with the equity in the house Angela had spent 2 years maintaining, was divided according to what she was legally entitled to, which turned out to be considerably more than Marcus and Doreen had hoped to leave her with. Renee disappeared from the picture almost entirely once the legal proceedings became public within the family, which told Angela everything she needed to know about how genuine those plans had ever really been beyond convenience for both parties involved. Doreen's relationship with her son grew strained in ways Angela hadn't anticipated, but didn't mourn either, because a woman who helps her adult son hide marital assets from his caretaking wife isn't owed much sympathy when that scheme collapses. Lisa helped Angela move into a small apartment across town during the same month the divorce was finalized, and within that apartment, for the first time in over 2 years, Angela slept a full night without listening for Marcus's call bell or the sound of labored breathing from the next room. She resumed her nursing coursework within a year, using a portion of her settlement to cover tuition she'd once assumed she would never have the time or money to return to. She didn't go back to the rehabilitation facility where she used to work nights, choosing instead a different clinic across the city, one with no memory of the version of her that used to leave shifts early to rush home to a husband who never once, in 2 years, asked how she was managing on 3 hours of sleep. Patricia, the aide Angela had hired in those final weeks, ended up staying on with Marcus permanently, which Angela found she could think about without bitterness, mostly because she no longer had any stake in what happened inside that house. There's a version of this story where Angela confronts Marcus the night she overhears that phone call, where she screams, where the marriage ends in a single explosive argument instead of a slow, deliberate unraveling that took weeks to execute properly. That version might have felt more satisfying in the moment. It almost certainly would have left her with far less than the version she actually chose. Angela understood something a lot of people learn too late in situations like hers, that quiet, methodical action often accomplishes more than confrontation ever could, especially when the person who wronged you has spent months building a story where you're the one who won't be believed. So here's the question worth sitting with. Was Angela's silence in those first weeks after the phone call an act of weakness, or was it the smartest thing she ever did in that marriage? Would you have confronted Marcus the same night you heard him call you a servant, or would you have done exactly what Angela did and let him believe nothing had changed while you quietly built the case that would cost him everything he thought he'd protected? Let us know in the comments what you would have done differently, and if this story kept you hooked until the end, don't forget to subscribe, because we've got another story coming soon.